Good morning. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Nice to see you all. Today, continuing in 2 Corinthians, as the British and the scholars call it, 2 Corinthians, as the rest of us call it, 11 through 21. I just put this little quote up here as a teaser. Now you'll eagerly anticipate knowing what that quote is going to refer to. You feel that anticipation? There you go. The violence of the storm is not over, but the sky... the violence of the storm is over, but the sky is not yet clear. Anyway, before we read today's passage, I want to do just a little backing up and talking about something that struck me from last week. Wilf was preaching over the previous verses, and I know this is a famous and well-known verse, and sometimes with famous and well-known verses, it's like we forget how profound they are. And it's 2 Corinthians 12:10, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." And it was great because last week, Shiloh, as he looked up and saw this verse printed on the slideshow, said, "Dad, that doesn't make any sense." And it was perfect because, of course, it doesn't make sense on its face. It's a paradox. And it just got me thinking about something that I think about a lot, a connected idea from Deuteronomy, where Moses sort of warns the people of Israel, be careful. When you're warm and you're well-fed and your cisterns are full and you move into the land where you've got a house that's been built for you and everything's going well, that's when you're most likely to walk away from me. And yet when you're sad and suffering, when you're hurt and lonely and needy, that's when you will tend to draw near because you need me. And I think there's some of that in that verse about weakness and strength. Just some other thoughts. Weakness is actually not weakness as it's presented in Scripture. It's strength, because weakness is truth. It describes our actual state. We don't always see our weakness, or we don't always feel it. When we're experiencing smooth sailing, we don't feel it all the time. But it is true, our continual state is one of utter dependence on God. And so weakness is honest. Jesus was weak and lowly. Paul was weak and lowly. So just finally, as we do this quick backtracking, how are you weak today? How are you weak this week or this year? Or in this stage of life that you find yourself in? What is your particular weakness? Something or some things probably come to mind. And I just want to encourage you all, in your weakness, turn to Jesus and acknowledge his sufficiency. He invites those of us who are weak and those of us who are needy to come to him. It's just such a good verse. Okay, moving forward by moving backward once again, but less deeply. 2 Corinthians is, just remember, one part and one side of an ongoing conversation between Paul, and he mentions Timothy, he mentions Titus, and in the previous letter to the Corinthians, the first one that we have, he mentions Sosthenes. So Paul and his ministry companions, and then their conversation with the assembly in Corinth. It maybe seems obvious, but we need to remember that this is a letter and that it's one side of a conversation. And so there's substantial inference that we're doing to try to understand where Paul is coming from and what is probably motivating some of his comments. Number 2 bullet point, Paul's promoting, as part of this letter, he's promoting and reminding the Corinthian church about a financial donation that he solicits from them to ease the suffering of the Jerusalem Christians who are going through a famine. And so asking for money is always a potentially complex thing to do. Thirdly, in Corinth, there's been mistrust, division, open sin that's been tolerated and strongly rebuked in Paul's previous letter, and what seems to be some slander toward Paul and his apostolic ministry. So it's not exactly an easy or simple relationship that they have as we observe this one-sided part of it moving forward. Some specific slander and challenges to Paul's legitimacy that he has named previously in the letter. He brings up some things that he's been told or that he's heard from the Corinthian church. Chapter 10, verse 1, he's bold in writing, Paul is, but he's timid in person. Sounds good on paper, but in person, Chapter 10, verse 7, he's not in Christ. This seems a little bold. Here's where I'm getting this, if you'd like to look with me, and you don't have to, but 10, verse 7, he says, you're looking only on the surface of things. If anyone's confident that he belongs to Christ, he should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as he. So, I don't know, maybe the phrase was never leveled directly at Paul, you're not in Christ, but there seems to be the insinuation that, well, some are in a little further than others, and Paul's not in there the way that we are. Chapter 10, verse 10, he's unimpressive. Verse 12, he's inferior to other apostles. Chapter 11, verse 4, he's gotten the gospel message wrong. That verse reads, for if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it easily enough. Apparently there's different versions, different ideas that are being preached by some of these other apostles that are coming through Corinth, and they're disagreeing with Paul, and the Corinthian church is going, yeah, sounds good to me. He's a poor speaker, verse 6 of chapter 11. He's not Hebrew enough. He's not a servant of Christ enough. Verses 21 through 23, where he feels like he needs to kind of reiterate, no, I am. So apparently these are things that are being leveled toward him. In the most recent preceding section, we're talking like, basically chapter 11, and then the first part of chapter 12, Paul has become direct, and that's a euphemism. He's actually getting pretty aggressive and assertive. He's defending himself because it seems like he's not being heard otherwise. And I wanted to show you this little clip. I immediately thought of this when I was reading the passage for today. Maybe you've seen this, or maybe you've read the books, because you too like to put on a cloak and pretend that you're an elfish warrior. Or maybe you just saw it because it was really famous. If you don't know, this guy here is a hobbit. He's a very unassuming fellow. He happens to have stumbled upon the most dangerous, most corrupting, most powerful weapon in the world that he lives in, and it's this ring right here. And it doesn't seem that way when you're holding it. It seems like the most wonderful thing that you just want to hold and wear all the time and love. And so it's this kind of picture of being drawn to something that's ultimately going to be your own destruction. And he's going to be confronted by a guy named Gandalf, who's a wizard. Now, this wizard is a very wise, very old, very competent, very powerful, very good character. And when he sees this ring in the hands of an unsuspecting fellow who he's pretty sure it's going to hurt, he wants him to get rid of it. So that's the central conflict here going on, and so let's see if it works.
There are many magic things in this world, but obeying to none in my pocket. Isn't that all? Yeah. After why not? Why should I keep it?
I think you should leave the room behind. Well, is that so hard?
What? No. And yes. No, it comes to it. I feel like talking with it. It's my property. It can't breathe.
There's no need to get angry.
It's your fault. It's mine. My precious.
Precious. It's been called that before. Not by you.
This isn't yours, but I know my own thing.
Did you hear that ring? Quite long enough.
You want it for yourself?
Do not take me for some conjurer of cheap tricks. I'm not trying to rob you. I'm trying to help you.
Probably a good place to stop, but you get the idea. So he tries the gentle approach. Thank you for all your technical help, everybody. He tries the gentle approach. I think you should leave that thing behind. No. That thing is not for you to keep. No. And then he starts getting, the little guy starts getting defensive and making accusations. And here we see Gandalf has the power to probably blow the roof off the place with his magical powers anytime he wants to. But that's not the method that he wants to use. But when forced to, he sort of has to, as the text puts it, if you're a real Tolkien nerd like I am, he's like, you're about to see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked. It's going to get serious here if you don't cut it out. Okay, so hopefully that provides a little context for, I think, where Paul is coming from in this passage here. He has just sort of dimmed the lights and stretched the ceiling with his powers. He's been saying, you need me to talk bluntly? You need me to come out and say what my qualifications are? Okay, I will. I didn't want to, but here you go. Okay, so we're going to pick it up then in chapter 12, verse 11, and go to 21. I have made a fool of myself, he says, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I'm not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. The things that mark an apostle, signs, wonders, and miracles, were done among you with great perseverance. How are you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. Now I'm ready to visit you for the third time, and I will not be a burden to you, because what I want is not your possessions, but you. And after all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. So I will gladly spend for you everything I have and expend myself as well. If I love you more, will you love me less? Be that as it may, I've not been a burden to you. Yet, crafty fellow that I am, I caught you by trickery. Did I exploit you through any of the men I sent you? I urged Titus to go to you and sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you, did he? Did we not act in the same spirit and follow the same course? Have you been thinking all along that we've been defending ourselves to you? We have been speaking in the sight of God as those in Christ. And everything we do, dear friends, is for your strengthening. For I'm afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. I fear that there may be outbursts of anger, factions, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder. I'm afraid that when I come again, my God will humble me before you. And I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged. if we look at some of these things side by side that he addresses in these verses, we're trying to piece together kind of what accusations or complaints have been leveled toward Paul. He says on the left here, we performed apostolic signs with great perseverance among you. It seems like the Corinthians were accusing, well, that got a little hot. Seems like the Corinthians were accusing him of not being a real apostle. He asks them rhetorically, how are you inferior to the other churches? Seems like the Corinthians were accusing him of favoring others over them. He says, I caught you by trickery. Did I exploit you? Did my colleagues? It seems like the Corinthians may have been accusing him to try to get money from them for some shady reason. You know, he's asking for a donation. Maybe he just wants to enrich himself. He says, everything we do is for your strengthening in God's sight. It seems like the Corinthians were accusing him of just being out for himself, his reputation, his gain. This is a little analogy that I have used with my kids. Oven mitts, always the preferred intervention. I remember when Maddie and Ezra were small enough that they were still in the same tub. Oh, it was so cute. Sometimes Ezra would get splashing, and he'd be like having a real good time splashing the water as hard. Well, of course, this splashes Maddie in the face. She didn't want to be splashed. And she would grab his hands and tell him to cut it out and raise her voice, right? And the thing I encouraged her to do was, Maddie, pretend like you have oven mitts on, and just, instead of grabbing his arms and telling him to stop it, just stick him out there and just like move him toward, ooh, don't splash so high. Yeah, we're not going to splash, right? You'll get a better result. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. In my classroom, you know, I've got a classroom full of 32 14-year-olds. I'm, of course, thrilling, but they don't always see it that way. And sometimes they're having a conversation that I think is going to cause them to miss something important. Instead of, I mean, you can call out kids by name and go, hey, you, cut it out. And sometimes you do. But most of the time you try to, hey guys, right? Just give them one of these. Don't try to threaten them too much because, you know, you want to keep the intervention small. The principle is the gentlest rebuke possible is generally the best one. It preserves your gentleness and your people's perception of that. It preserves dignity of the person being redirected, and it prevents a rough aftermath, is the idea. In other words, no one should really revel in pulling rank, but sometimes one has to. And I think that's what we see here in Paul's words. I found this cool commentary. It wasn't hard. It's like, you know, you Google commentary, and if you guys don't know about this, just know this is a simple tool that's available to anyone all the time. You just type in your verses and add the word commentary, and usually Bible Hub will come up on the first 2 or 3 hits on the search. There's some interest, sometimes when you're struggling with a verse or a section, it's just nice to see what other people have said about it or interpret it as. Here's a guy named Ellicott, and I'm not actually familiar with who that is, but this is an English writer, and he says this. I thought it was worth reading because it was really nicely written. I am become a fool in glorying. Okay, so these are Paul's, some of Paul's words. I've become a fool for boasting, or I've become a fool. He says the last 2 words, I don't know if you can even begin to read that. The last 2 words are wanting in the better manuscripts. And the verse opens with a somewhat thrilling abruptness. I am become insane. It was you who compelled me. The words are partly ironical, partly speak of an impatient consciousness of what he had been saying, would seem to give color to the opprobrious epithets that had been flung at him. The passage on which we now enter, and of which we may think has begun after a pause, is remarkable for the reproduction in a compressed form of most of the topics, each with its characteristic phrase on which he had before dwelt. So in other words, this guy's seeing patterns of what Paul's been talking about throughout the letter, all kind of touched upon in these verses that we just read. The violence of the storm is over, but the sky is not yet clear, and we still hear the mutterings of the receding thunder. He remembers once more that he has been called insane, that he has been taunted with commending himself, that he has been treated as nothing in comparison with those apostles extraordinary, or super apostles, who were setting themselves up as his rivals. I, he says, with an emphatic stress on the pronoun, ought to have had no need for this painful self-assertion. You ought to have acknowledged my labor and my love for you. I didn't read it as well as it was written, but man, such a good writer. And I think an interesting interpretation or a way of putting how Paul is acting there. At first, I had a little trouble coming up with what do we do with these verses? It seems like it's kind of the end of a rant, a deserved rant, but not necessarily easy to pull, 3 steps for a better life out of. But here are some thoughts. From the sort of Corinthian side of things, if you're going to poke the bear may respond. If you have a plank in your eye, it's best not to go looking for specks in other people's eyes. So the Corinthian church had a lot of problems, and they needed a lot of rebuke and correction. And yet it seems like too many of them were spending their time looking for things to complain about Paul. It's easy to lose sight of the big picture and start making judgments about unimportant things. So the continual complaint about Paul is that he sounds good on paper, but in person, he's just not that impressive. He was too humble. He was a disappointment in some ways, and that's an interesting thing to contemplate. But they're losing the forest for the trees. Of course, Paul's investment in them and Paul's gospel message and Paul's example to them and Paul's patience with them should have been a larger thing to them. When we start questioning people's motives, we're in very sensitive territory. Of course, we may need to do it sometimes, but we must be very cautious. We should appreciate our leaders, ministers, deacons, looking to their hearts, their strengths, and their service. We should give them the benefit of the doubt. Actually, I started thinking of some more once I started going. So, some other stuff we might take away from these verses. This is more like from sort of Paul's experience of things, you might pour your heart and soul into a ministry and be misunderstood and maligned and criticized. The race is not always to the swift, as we were reading this morning. Leading, advising, serving, and pouring into a church appears to be very hard work in most cases. So we probably know this sort of intuitively, and yet it's in black and white here in the verses that we've read. If it was a struggle for Paul, surely it'll be a struggle for most of us. There are no guarantees that people will do as we earnestly desire them to do. An open, honest, even intense communication is sometimes just what a situation calls for. There are probably different interpretations of Paul in these verses. Some might interpret Paul as losing his cool, and that might be a bad thing. That might be like maybe Paul is flirting with sinning in his anger. I think the traditional interpretation, or at least my assumption, is that he's been goaded into this, and this is a rightful display of anger. But it was something they needed to talk about. It was something he felt he needed to clear on his side of things. And maybe that speaks to something that you're going through as well. Maybe sometimes the air needs to be cleared in a way that feels like it's going to be uncomfortable or unpleasant. But that might be the thing that's needed. Okay, I was on a roll. I don't know, they just kept coming to me. Paul continues to model a desire to give. Oh, I got it. A desire to give and serve the church. So even after this, he's like, look, I'm coming back and I'm going to spend everything I have for you guys because I love you. That's impressive patience and focus. Paul compares himself to a parent, expending himself for his children. And that's a worthy image for us to aspire to as we serve and as we work with each other. Paul has a clear conscience before God, and he lays himself open to the people who have wounded him, anticipating further humiliation. He says, I kind of anticipate that I'm going to get there, and it's going to be a bummer. So what a commitment for someone to share that and to yet keep going. And then Paul ultimately closes this section with a renewed passion for the sanctification of the believers in Corinth. He's still putting them first, and that's his goal. So may we not grow weary of doing good and building others up. And that's all I have. Thank you.